The text came at 6:47 inches the morning, before my alarm, before my coffee. Before I had any reason to think the day would be anything other than ordinary. It was from a number I didn't recognize. No name. Just a message that read, "This is Marcus Webb. I was your father's accountant for 11 years. I need you to call me back before you go into the office today. Don't mention this to your business partner. Please." I sat up in bed and read it 3 times. My business partner. My best friend since college. The guy who stood next to me at my father's funeral 2 years ago, arm around my shoulder, telling me we'd get through it together. The guy I trusted with every financial decision our company had made for the past 4 years. I called Marcus back immediately. He picked up on the first ring, like he'd been holding the phone in his hand waiting. His voice was calm but deliberate. The voice of a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and wanted to get it exactly right. "I'm sorry to contact you this way," he said. "I retired 8 months ago. I've been trying to stay out of other people's business. But I came across something last week that I couldn't sit on. Not with your father being who he was to me." I told him to just say it. He exhaled slowly. "Your partner has been meeting with a commercial attorney named Diane Chu for the past 3 months. I know her. We worked in the same building for years. She reached out to me last week asking questions about the terms of your father's estate transfer, specifically how the business shares were handled when ownership passed to you. I thought it was routine. Then she mentioned your partner's name. Then I started asking my own questions. I didn't say anything. The room felt like it had gone very still. I pulled some strings," Marcus continued, "called in a favor with someone who still works in that circle. What I found out is that your partner has been building a case to contest the legitimacy of the ownership transfer after your father passed. He's claiming the shares were improperly assigned to you and that as a co-founder, he's entitled to majority control. He's been doing this quietly for months. The filing is scheduled for the end of this month." I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. My partner. My best friend. The person who had called me every single day for a week after my father died. Who had handled every vendor call, every payroll run, every client meeting so I could grieve without watching everything fall apart. Who had told me, standing in my father's kitchen 3 days after the funeral, "This company is yours. Your dad built it for you. I'm just here to help you run it." I thanked Marcus. Told him I wouldn't forget it. He told me to be careful and said he hoped he was wrong, even though we both knew he wasn't. I didn't go into the office that morning. I drove to a diner 12 minutes from my house, sat in a corner booth, ordered black coffee, and opened my laptop. I needed to think before I moved. And I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I showed a single card. My father had started the company 18 years ago as a regional logistics firm out of a strip mall in suburban Ohio. By the time I joined full-time 6 years ago, it had grown into something real: 22 employees, 4 warehouse contracts, and enough annual revenue to make it worth fighting over. My partner had come in as a co-founder 4 years ago with capital and operational experience. My father had liked him. That mattered to me, maybe too much. When my father passed, the shares transferred to me by the terms of the estate. It was clean, it was documented, it was what my father had wanted. I had the paperwork. I had the attorney who drafted it. I had everything. But I also knew that everything could be picked apart by someone patient enough and well-funded enough to try. I paid for my coffee and drove to a law office on the west side of the city that a former client had once mentioned during a dinner conversation. An attorney named Roland Price. Old school. Former corporate litigator who had moved into business law 15 years ago. His assistant told me he had a cancellation at 10. I took it. Roland was the kind of man who listened without interrupting and took notes without looking down at the paper. I told him everything. The text from Marcus. The contested ownership transfer. The timeline. He asked 3 follow-up questions, each one sharper than the last, and then he leaned back in his chair. "Do you have access to your partner's communication channels through company systems?" he asked. I told him that, as co-owner, I had administrative access to the company email server. "Then before you do anything else," he said, "you need to know what's already been sent. Because the filing at the end of the month isn't the beginning of this. That's just where it becomes public." I went home and logged into the server. I told myself I was just going to look at recent activity. Timestamps. Nothing invasive. Just enough to understand the shape of what was happening. What I found took me an hour to get through and left me sitting in silence for another 20 minutes after. The emails went back further than 3 months. They went back almost 9. There were threads with Diane Chu, exactly as Marcus had described. But there were also threads with 2 of our largest warehouse clients I had brought in personally, clients my father had cultivated over years where my partner had been quietly positioning himself as the primary contact, subtly suggesting in the language of the emails that a transition in leadership was coming and that they should be thinking about who their real long-term partner in this business was going to be. There was an email from 6 weeks ago to our head of operations, a woman named Sandra who had been with my father for 9 years. The email told her that I had been struggling with the direction of the company since my father's death and that my partner was working behind the scenes to stabilize things. It told her to route any major decisions through him directly for the time being. There was one more email, sent 3 days ago from my partner's personal account to Diane Chu. It said, "He still doesn't know. Keep everything sealed until the 28th. Once the filing drops, the leverage is ours. He won't want a public fight. He still doesn't know." I closed the laptop slowly and set it on the desk and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a long time. He was right that I wouldn't want a public fight. He knew me well enough to know that. He had been counting on it. The whole strategy was built around the assumption that I would see the filing, feel the ground shift under me, and choose to negotiate rather than fight, probably settling for a minority position in my own father's company just to avoid the spectacle of a courtroom. What he didn't know was that I'd already been to Roland's office. And that Roland had been very clear about what we were going to do instead. I went back into the office that afternoon like nothing had happened. My partner was in the conference room on a call when I walked in. He waved through the glass. I waved back and smiled and went to my desk. Sandra brought me a stack of invoices to sign. I signed them all and asked her how her weekend had been. She seemed slightly surprised that I was asking. I made a note of that. Over the next 10 days, I performed a version of myself so convincingly that I almost believed it. I came in early. I bought donuts for the team on a Wednesday. I sat in on a client lunch with my partner and laughed at his jokes and agreed with his suggestions and let him think that everything between us was exactly what it had always been. Underneath that, I was working with Roland every evening after hours. We pulled the original ownership documents and had them reviewed by 2 separate estate attorneys, both of whom confirmed they were airtight. We contacted the warehouse clients my partner had been quietly grooming and had straightforward conversations about the company's future that re-established my role clearly without tipping anything off. I also had a long, honest conversation with Sandra. That one was hard. I sat across from her in a small cafe near the office and told her what I'd found, including the email my partner had sent her. She went quiet for a moment, then set down her coffee cup and said, "I thought something felt wrong. I just didn't know what." She gave me a written account of every instruction she'd received from my partner over the past 6 months that hadn't come through the normal decision-making process. It added 4 more pages to Roland's file. With 3 days left before the scheduled filing, Roland called me and said we were ready. I asked him to walk me through exactly what was going to happen, and he did, step by step. When he finished, I told him to go ahead. On the morning of the 25th, 3 days before my partner had planned to file, I called him and told him I wanted to have a company strategy meeting that afternoon. Just the 2 of us, in the main conference room. I told him I had some ideas about Q3 I wanted to run past him. He said he'd be there. Sounded relaxed. Easy. I got to the office an hour early. I made sure everything was in order. The documents were with Roland. The logistics were set. I sat at the head of the conference table and drank my coffee and waited. My partner walked in at 2 on the dot. He had his laptop, a yellow legal pad, a coffee from the place down the street he went to every day. He sat down across from me and set everything out in front of him and looked up with the same easy smile he'd given me 1,000 times. "So what are we thinking for Q3? He asked. I looked at him for a moment. This person I had built something real with, who had sat at the table across from me in rooms bigger and smaller than this one, who had been there on the worst day of my life and had, apparently, started making his plans around the same time. "I know about the filing," I said. The easy smile didn't disappear immediately. It took about 2 full seconds. Then it was gone. "What filing?" he said. "The one Diane Chu has been preparing since February. The contested ownership transfer. The argument that the shares were improperly assigned when my father's estate transferred." I kept my voice steady. "I know about all of it." He set down his coffee cup. His jaw tightened. Then, and I'll never forget this, he sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath like he'd been holding it for months, and the expression that replaced the smile wasn't guilt. It was calculation. He was already shifting into a different mode. "Look," he said, "this doesn't have to be a fight. I should have come to you directly. I know that. But the reality is that your father's estate transfer had procedural issues that create real exposure for the company. I was trying to address them in a way that would protect both of us. By filing without telling me. By having everything ready, so we could negotiate from a position of strength." "Whose strength?" I said. He spread his hands flat on the table. "Marcus Webb had no business contacting you. Whatever he told you, I didn't say Marcus Webb told me anything. He stopped. I let the silence sit for a moment. I found the emails, I said. All of them. Including the one you sent 3 days ago saying I still didn't know. I paused. And the one to Sandra. And the ones to our warehouse clients. His face changed. The calculation gave way to something else, something closer to the recognition that the shape of the situation was no longer what he thought it was. Those emails were private, he said quietly. You sent them through a server that I have administrative access to as co-owner, I said. Which, for the record, I still am. He leaned forward. What do you want? I reached into the folder in front of me and slid a document across the table. Roland Price drafted this yesterday. It's a formal notice that as of today, your involvement in company operations is suspended pending a legal review of your conduct, specifically the unauthorized client communications, the misrepresentation of company leadership to a long-term employee, and the coordinated effort to file a fraudulent ownership contest. He looked at the document. You can't. The filing you had scheduled for the 28th, I said. Roland filed a preemptive motion yesterday evening. The judge signed off this morning. Everything is frozen pending review. Your attorney has already been notified. He stared at me. The warehouse clients you've been working on? I continued. I spoke with both of them last week. They're staying. Sandra has provided a written account of the instructions you gave her over the past 6 months. That's in the file too. The room was very quiet. You were going to let me walk into a courtroom, I said. You were going to contest my father's estate in a public filing. You were going to tell a judge that the company my father spent 18 years building wasn't rightfully mine. I stopped. That's not a disagreement about Q3 strategy. That's not a positioning conversation. That's something I can't come back from with you. He tried one more time. His voice dropped, got quieter, got warmer. The voice he'd used the day of my father's funeral. We built this together, he said. Your father would have wanted us both to. Don't, I said. He closed his mouth. You can resign or you can be removed, I said. Roland has outlined both options in the document. If you resign within 5 business days, we handle the separation cleanly and privately. If you force the removal, everything goes into the record. The emails, the client communications, the attempt to defraud the estate, all of it. He sat there for a long time. His coffee went cold. The legal pad in front of him was still blank. Finally he said, You knew this whole time. For 10 days, I said. And you just, he shook his head slowly. You just came in every morning like nothing was happening. I had things to take care of first. I said. He picked up his pen. Set it back down. Looked at the document again. I need to talk to my attorney, he said. Of course, I said. You have my number. He gathered his things slowly, like a man who has just realized that the ground under him isn't solid, that it hadn't been solid for a while, and that he'd been the last one to find out. At the door, he paused and turned back and looked at me with something that might have been genuine feeling and might have been strategy. Even then, I couldn't be sure anymore. I thought you'd fold, he said quietly. I thought without your father. I know what you thought, I said. He left. The door closed behind him. I sat at the head of the conference table in my father's company and let the quiet settle. He resigned the following Tuesday. Sent the signed paperwork to Roland directly. No call, no email to me, nothing personal. Just the document, signed and dated, delivered in a sealed envelope. Roland called to confirm receipt and I thanked him and told him to finalize everything. Within 2 weeks, the preemptive motion had cleared. The ownership documentation was fully validated on the record. No ambiguity, no procedural gaps, nothing Diane Chu or anyone else would be able to argue around. It was done. Sandra stopped by my office the afternoon I came back from signing the final paperwork. She knocked on the open door and stood there for a moment and then said, Your father would have handled it the same way. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. She started to leave and then turned back and said, He used to say that the company was only as strong as the people who actually believed in it. Yeah, I said. He used to say that to me too. She smiled and went back to her desk. I stayed in the office late that night. Went through the Q3 numbers. Called 2 vendors about a contract renewal. Did the ordinary work that a company requires when you're actually focused on running it and not on what someone else is trying to take from you. Before I locked up, I walked through the main floor. The chairs pushed in at the conference table. The whiteboards with last quarter's projections still written in my father's handwriting, because I'd never quite been able to erase them. The framed photo on the wall near the entrance that someone had hung when the company moved into this space years ago. My father standing in front of the original location with 2 employees who had both retired by now, everyone squinting into the sun, everyone looking like they didn't quite believe yet what they were building. I stood there for a while. Then I turned off the lights and locked the door and drove home. There was one thing left. One piece I'd been thinking about for 10 days, ever since I sat in that diner with my coffee and read through the emails for the first time and started to understand exactly what had been built around me while I was looking the other way. The commercial attorney, Diane Chu. She had built a case on documents she believed to be accurate. She had been given information by my partner that was either misleading or outright false. That wasn't entirely her fault. But it wasn't entirely clean either. I called Marcus the following morning. I thanked him again, properly this time, not just the quick thank you I'd given him when my mind was still spinning. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good. Your father was a fair man. He raised you right." I asked him if he would be willing to put his account of the conversation with Diane Chu into a formal statement. He said yes, without hesitation. That statement went to the State Bar's Ethics Review Board the following week, along with Roland's documentation of how the case had been prepared. I didn't file a complaint personally. Roland submitted it through the appropriate channels as a factual account of the conduct involved. What happened after that was up to the board. But Roland told me quietly that the conduct described, specifically the knowing preparation of a fraudulent ownership contest using misrepresented estate documents, was the kind of thing the board took seriously. I didn't follow up on it after that. It wasn't mine to follow up on. What was mine was the company. What was mine was the work of it. The day-to-day weight and necessity of it, the 22 people who showed up every morning because this place was part of how they paid their rent and fed their families and moved their lives forward. My father had known that. He'd reminded me of it once when I was frustrated about something early in my time there, something I can't even remember now. He'd said, "A business isn't just a financial arrangement, it's an obligation. You don't get to walk away from it because it gets hard." I hadn't walked away. And no one was going to take it from me. Months later, I hired a new operations director to take on some of what my former partner had handled. Her name was Michelle, former logistics manager from a firm in Cincinnati, sharp and direct and completely uninterested in anything except doing the job well. She asked me in her first week what I thought the company's biggest vulnerability was. I thought about it for a moment. "Complacency," I said. "Assuming that because something looks solid, it is." She looked at me like she was trying to figure out if I was speaking generally or about something specific. I just handed her the Q4 projections and told her to let me know what she thought by Friday. Some stories end with a dramatic scene. A door slamming. A confrontation that everyone remembers. And yes, there was that. There was the conference room and the cold coffee and the moment when my former partner realized that the plan he had been quietly building for 9 months had already been quietly dismantled before he ever got the chance to use it. But honestly, the part I think about most isn't that moment. It's the early morning in the diner. The coffee going cold because I forgot to drink it. The laptop open on the table. The slow, steady process of deciding not to panic, not to confront, not to react but to think. To be careful. To build something sturdy before the collision came. My father was like that. He used to say that the worst thing you could do in a crisis was move fast before you understood what you were actually dealing with. I'm still learning how to be that kind of person. But that morning, I think I got it right. And that's the thing they never factor in, the ones who are quietly building their plans around you. They assume you are what you appear to be in the ordinary moments. They assume that because you haven't fought yet, you don't know how. They don't consider that you might just be waiting until you're ready.